How much money does New York State owe your school? That is the question that we'll be addressing today. And we can see here, begin the discussion. In 2006, the Intermediate Court of New York State of Appeals ordered New York State to pay $4.7 billion per year for the next 4 years, with an additional $9.2 billion in the facilities funding to be accomplished over 5 years. Now, that money was paid. The first two installments were made in 2007 and 2008. But as many people say, that money was not distributed effectively, as principals were only required to report how they intended to use the money and not how they actually spent. Now, the distribution of funds was frozen for the 2009-2010 school year and slashed by $2.7 billion during 2010 and 2011. Now, that's a lot of money. During this current school year, $1.3 billion of school aid was increased, but unfortunately, that was inadequate to restore many programs that had been taken away. So, what's really in the numbers? What is owed by state to the schools? Well, according to the New York State Department of Education, $4.8 billion, with 72% of that $4.8 billion owed to high-need schools. Now, this is not just in New York City that were affected. It's all across the state, with every Senate and Assembly district owed money. That ranges from a mere $6 million to a whopping $288 million. And if you're wondering exactly how much is owed to New York City, well, that's just a measly $2,046,495,248, and you can keep the change. Now, what we owe you is a conversation so we can understand and break this all down. And for that, we go to my co-host, Melody.
So 2 weeks ago, a new report on school funding was launched by the Alliance for Quality Education. Taking into consideration how much Governor Cuomo proposed for education in his address last week, advocates are not going to be happy. To help us navigate this complex situation, we want to welcome back Zakiyah Ansari, Advocacy Director for Alliance for Quality Education. Nice to see you again. And Charles Kahn, an organizer and community advocate with Strong Economy for All, a coalition of unions and community organizations. Thank you for joining us, Charles. Okay, Zakiyah, for those of us who haven't been following this case for the past 13 plus years, can you give us an overview of the case and its timeline?
Sure. I mean, I want to say that the plus is actually 23 years, right? Because 1993 was then when a parent who then turned city council member Robert Jackson, kind of the Mr. CFE himself, along with other parents, brought this issue to the state, and where his complaint was, and still is, right, that New York State is not meeting its constitutional obligation to provide every child in New York State a sound basic education. And that's what the Constitution says. And so even then, parents were going up there. Now, in 2006, when I personally then brought my 10-year-old and 12-year-old up to Albany with me, right, actually my 12-year-old got to sit in the court as they were listening to the decision come down. So 2006, we finally, the highest court of appeals, upheld that decision. And you know, good or bad, Governor Spitzer absolutely put a historic amount of money, but that was because of the advocacy and the organizing on the ground of $6 billion. And so it was because of the advocacy of parents and students from around the state over that last year before 2006, when the decision came down, that we got the governor to commit to putting that money in, lots of money. And as you reported, as Aaron said, we still haven't seen the full funding.
What is, you mentioned the CFE?
So the Campaign for Fiscal Equity was an equity lawsuit like we see in so many states. So like in New Jersey, they have the Abbott case, right, which was to provide funding to the highest needs districts and the highest needs students, and to begin to create that, fulfill the Constitution in providing every child with a sound basic education, which we weren't seeing. And so it was to go towards smaller class sizes, to create changes in middle school and high school, to provide out of school time, like things like that we know work, that would go to special needs students, students living in poverty, English language learners, et cetera, right? Those students who need the supports the most.
And you're talking about students who need the support the most. Charles, who exactly are those students?
Right, so when you think about, really there's poverty all over New York State, right? Like childhood poverty is at the highest level that it's been in the history of New York State. And a lot of those high need school districts are in the city, they're upstate, they're Long Island. So we're really talking about all of the kids of New York State, right? There are a select few children that live in districts where there are really high property values, right, and those districts are able to fund their schools, but just about everybody else is suffering. They're struggling.
Not only a tale of two cities, but a tale of two schools.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And really what we look at is restoring the CFE funding, but what we want to see, our vision, our kind of dream for our children and our future, is to have schools that provide more than just the basics, right? And that's going to call for additional funding, right? And I think New York State has that money. There are a lot of millionaires and billionaires in New York State that are making more.
The piggy bank.
Yeah, they're making more money than they've ever made before, right? There was a report that released last week. The 62 richest people in the world now have more money than everybody else.
Than half the world. Yeah.
Right? Their net worth went up to $1.76 trillion. And in New York State and in the United States of America, we have things like the carried interest loophole, right, which is something that hedge fund managers on Wall Street use. And if we close that loophole in New York State, we could raise $6 billion annually.
$6 billion.
Yes, that's every year, right? And that's the kind of investment that we need to make in kind of New York's biggest resource, which is our people. Right? I mean,
right.
A lot of these hedge fund managers, they pay less taxes than the teachers that teach Zakiyah's kids. They pay less taxes than the sanitation workers that pick up our garbage. They pay less taxes than the nurses that take care of us when we're sick, right? And what we're asking them to do is pay their fair share, right? And to really stand up for our kids and make an investment in New York State.
So the whole state is owed this much money per year. So many elected officials are involved and owed money as well. Why is there not a bigger uproar?
About the CFE money? I think there are folks like Charles Barron, for example, right, who understand that enough is enough. I mean, he's Mr. Black Panther. He's not going to sit through and allow the rhetoric of Governor Cuomo to continue. And while many might not have agreed the way he did it, and the people and the parents and the community members are grateful for that, right? Because he said enough is enough. I'm not going to sit here and listen to this anymore, especially because he knows, especially in the district where he is, that the lack of funding is absolutely hurting the young people that live in his community and that he serves. So I think there are some that absolutely. There are some of the elected officials, assembly members who have been day one in regards to CFE. But we also know that, the governor is, getting donations from a lot of these hedge fund folks, and that money doesn't come without any strings attached. And unfortunately, time and time again, it's our children that are at the short end of that stick. And enough is enough, right? And so it has been our role as AQE to organize parents, to engage students and parents and community from all across the state, not just New York City, but in every area, every corner where parents and students and schools are being shortchanged, to hold those elected officials accountable, because we're tired of the talk and we're like, we'll walk the walk.
And it's a court order, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we should be able to take legal action against the state at this point, right? I mean, who's keeping us from doing that?
So I think, the funding for schools battle, it's a state battle, right? So a lot of our city council members here in New York City have stood up and they said that they want the money, but it's really, the ball isn't
to them.
It's not up to them.
It keeps going around. As I did, research for this piece right here, like you said, it's not 15 years ago, it's not 23 years ago. It was back to 1978 where this legislation and the organizing was originally sort of being put forth. So can you just sort of walk us through what the educational system was like in New York City as it sort of progressed through the decades, and has New York City schools always been underfunded? Like, at what point did it become underfunded?
Well, I know in Black and Brown communities, it's always been underfunded, right? So, and that's the majority of the children that would receive this money. So if we're going to take it in that context of CFE, absolutely, it always has been, right? And if, who knows, if it wasn't for Robert Jackson and other parents bringing this, we still might not even have that piece of a CFE lawsuit to hold on to have that mantra to say, fulfill this promise to our children.
But how long will this sort of play out in the courts? The court mandates something, then there's an appeal, then they double down and say, no, we want this. How long can this sort of go back and forth before the money has to be put into the bank?
Well, I mean, and Charles, you should jump in too, I mean, the decision, the reality is if we had a court decision and we didn't pay it, we would be held liable or accountable. Unfortunately, It doesn't seem like that works for the state, right? But having said that as well, we're looking at the possibility of having to go back to court. So there's a small cities case that was just decided upon that looks like it could help absolutely on the CFE front if we decide to do that. But we may need to go back to court to ask the judge and the court to look at this and say how much longer. As I shared, my daughters were 10 and 12 when I brought them to Albany with me. They are now 20 and going on 22, third year of college, second year of college, and my son is in 10th grade, and he still has not yet to fulfill to receive the benefits of that CFE funding, right? And I have 3 grandchildren, right? And so even as you say, a dream deferred, our report absolutely acknowledges that we released earlier this month, which was students versus the state of New York, what happens to a dream deferred. Right, and it allows us and elected officials and others for us to hold them accountable. But hopefully, what it also does is it puts that money into a context. Because when you see I'm owed $500 million, and you're at the same time you have schools come into your office and they're telling you about all the things they don't have, the urge is like, to your point,
is high-need schools.
Absolutely, and that's New York City, period. That's the whole.
And part of the reason
is that New York City?
Well, no, it's across the state, but I'm saying, like, you know, New York City is in great need.
Right.
That's all high needs.
Have we seen, or can you explain to us how has the governor's position sort of evolved? Because I was reading through this, you know, Pataki weighed in a lot into these waters, Spitzer, Patterson, but how has the governor's position sort of changed as he's been in office?
So I think, you know, when the governor came into office, right, we were right at the beginning of a financial recession, right? And that's part of the reason why it took so long for the funding, because the New York State said, we can't pay this right now, right? And I think people understood that New York was in a tough financial situation, but where we are now, there aren't any excuses, right? This year alone, New York State had a $2 billion surplus. And we look at, again, going back to those people, hedge fund billionaires and people on Wall Street, they're making more money than ever, right?
Bonuses are back on the table.
Yeah,
bonuses are back on the table.
Absolutely, and you ask any elected official, they're saying, you know, New York is getting back on its feet. It's doing really well, but you look in these communities, you look at these schools, and they're not back on their feet. They're still struggling. They're still cutting, you know, classes, cutting teachers. I mean, when the decision was coming around, I was still in high school, right? Like I was a junior. I was a junior in high school, and I remember my teachers, you know, great teachers, begging me to ask my mom and my dad to write them, you know, a letter, you know, to the principal so they can keep their job. These were amazing teachers that lost their job because, you know, New York State at that time couldn't fund it, but at this point now they're just, you know, they're not taking the effort, they're not making the effort, right? And this falls squarely on the governor's shoulders.
Right. He's now promised $2.1 billion. How does that compare to what's really owed right now?
Trail the back end over 2 years. And it's very important that a lot of folks miss that part. $2 billion over 2 years. There is no 2-year budget. Every year the budget changes. And today in the Amsterdam News, Charles Barron has an op-ed where he absolutely goes line by line, fact and reality. And that is the reality. For the governor to say that he's actually only proposing, he's proposing less than $1 billion, right. $960 million. Board of Regents says $2.4 billion. AQE is saying $2.9 billion, way short. Not new, not different, because last year was the same thing. He is not committed to this. And I want to say that someone who's been doing educational advocacy work for the last 15 years, I think Charles is being too kind, because I remember coming up prior to the market crashing and people telling me over and over again, we have no money, we have no money. Market crash, we have no money. We rebounded, we have no money. So I don't buy the excuse anymore that we have no money, because we've seen it over and over again. And I you know, even when I was going up there when the market crashed, that doesn't help children who sit in schools when their art and music programs are being cut, right. When you're losing teachers, as Charles said, when you can't provide social workers and sports programs, but your school is doing okay. So in reality, what you're telling me, that we don't have money for those black and brown kids and those kids that were poor. Unacceptable. Unacceptable. And that's what the governor tells us too, when he only proposes $960 million, when just to maintain, not to be able to improve conditions, right. To maintain, we need over $2 billion. Then you're telling me you're not committed to our children. Blank, I mean, period, exclamation point.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you like to add to that? I think we have about 60 seconds left. It was so articulate and well put.
I think Zakiyah, it kind of closed the show.
Right.
I think that's exactly it, right? The money is there, right? We live in one of the richest states, right, in our country, and it's a travesty, right? It's a crime. It's literally a crime, you know, to not be putting the money, putting the effort, and making the investments in our communities, in our children, you know, so that we can really be the greatest state, so that we can really give them an opportunity to succeed, so that we can really, you know, look forward to the bright futures, you know, of our children that are growing up, of the people in our community, you know, of our biggest resource, you know, our people, New Yorkers.
Our biggest resource is our people. So we'll just leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your advocacy, and the struggle continues.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you.